Welcome to Global Gender Issues Conversations. My name is Pedro Dos Santos. I'm a political science professor at the College of St. Benedictine and St. John's University in Minnesota. I'm creating some videos with the help of some great colleagues to help my students in my Global Gender Issues class learn more about some important issues. Hence the very creative name, Global Gender Issues Conversations. Before we begin, I want to show a picture of my lovely dog Hansel, who decided to make a cameo on the very beginning of the interview. Today I talked to Dr. Jenniffer Piscopo on her research about pandemic performance and women leadership. Dr. Piscopo is associate professor of politics at Occidental College in Los Angeles, California. Her research on women and political representation in Latin America, the United States, and the globe has appeared in over 20 peer-reviewed journals and numerous edited volumes. She co-edits the journal Politics, Groups, and Identities and consults regularly for international organizations such as UN Women. Her public-facing writing papers regularly appear in outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Review, Mrs. Magazine, and the Smithsonian. Today we talk mostly about her new politics and gender piece called Women Leaders and Pandemic Performance, a Spurious Correlation, and her co-author piece at the Washington Post, Monkey Cage, with what she wrote with Dr. Kendall Funk called Are Women Leaders Better at Fighting the Coronavirus? Here is my interview with Dr. Piscopo, and with a quick intro by my dog Hansel. Well, thank you again for being here, Jen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And so let's start with this question. What inspired you to challenge this narrative about women leaders fighting COVID better? And my dog just decided to bark here right now. I think the
That's perfect. Here. That's exactly what we're all experiencing during the pandemic.
We're home. What inspired you to write this narrative about women leaders fighting COVID better? Isn't saying that women leaders don't matter a little off-brand, or someone who advocates for electing more women, for someone who advocates for electing more women to office?
Right. So I think absolutely, my work is really dedicated on raising the proportion of women in office and thinking about how governments and countries can do better at electing women. So it is a little off-brand for me to be pushing back against this idea that first appeared in the media in April, that countries led by women were better at containing the coronavirus. But I was looking at those stories and I noticed that the countries that kept coming up, right, Germany, New Zealand, Taiwan, right, these were the examples. They're countries that have women leaders and we're also doing very well at containing the pandemic. I noticed there was something else going on with those countries, right? These are wealthy countries. They're countries that political scientists attribute to having a lot of what we call state capacity. So a lot of strong governments that are able to effectively make policy. And also on the citizen side, they're countries that have citizens that have high levels of trust in government. They're countries that have citizens that are accustomed to being taken care of by their governments. These are countries that spend a lot, for instance, on social services. And so I was looking at these narratives and thinking, well, there's something exceptional about these countries. Yes, they have women leaders, but they also seem to have all of these other factors that would speak well for their ability to contain the coronavirus pandemic. And so I wanted to explore a little bit about what made these kinds of countries exceptional. And I think the other part of it was that as much as I truly believe we need more women in office for reasons of justice and reasons of fairness, one of the things we see as gender and politics researchers is the persistence of justifying women's presence in office, not because of fairness, but because of gender stereotypes that maybe women do better or are more caring. And this narrative also seemed to be falling into the trap of those gender stereotypes. Even positive gender stereotypes are still stereotypes, right? So that countries led by women have more caring leaders, and that's why they're performing better. So I wanted to both understand what was really going on with these countries that was making them exceptional and sort of push back against this idea that women are essentially different in some way, because I think it's problematic, and we can talk more about that, but I think it's problematic to justify women's presence and leadership on the grounds that women are different in some way.
Mm-hmm. Can you walk us through the argument on your Politics and Gender article about the spurious correlation between
Sure.
women and COVID and why that matters?
Yeah, so a spurious correlation is the technical term where we think that there's one variable that's causing another variable, right? So we think these two variables are causally related. So women leaders causing pandemic performance to be better. But if you say that relationship is spurious, you mean it's actually an illusion of causality, and that there's some other factor that would both explain why you have the cause, say why you would have a woman leader, and then why you would have the outcome, say why you would contain the coronavirus better. So if we look at where there are women leaders in the country today, we see that women leaders are predominantly concentrated in what we call the global north, so the wealthy liberal democracies, not predominantly concentrated in what we would call the global south, so more developing, less wealthy countries. That's actually really different now in 2020 than 20 years ago, right? So 20 years ago, the kinds of countries that had women leaders were much more likely to be in the global south. They were more likely to be poor. They were more likely to be transitioning towards democracy or engaged in a democratic transition, and they were more likely to have weak governments. But right now, that's not the case, right? So where do we find women leaders? New Zealand, Taiwan, Scandinavia, Western Europe, right? Wealthy, stable democracies with a lot of state capacity. So my argument in the piece is that it's actually countries with high levels of state capacity are both more likely to elect women and more likely to contain the coronavirus better. So I look at things in the piece like trust in government, social spending, how much governments spend on social programs, citizens' perceptions of corruption, measures that political scientists have to gauge whether governments are impartial and fair and effective in delivering policy. And in all these metrics, these are both the kinds of countries that have women. So countries that excel on these metrics are both the kinds that have women and the kinds that are containing the coronavirus better. I mean, this makes sense, right? You need to contain a pandemic, you need to have governments issue reliable scientific advice, and you need to have citizens who are disposed to follow that advice, right? So you need both capable governments and trusting and engaged citizens. And what's really important is that countries don't develop capable governments or trusting citizens overnight, right? So it's not the case that these countries elect women and then women make the governments capable and make citizens trustworthy. Women could enhance those trends, and I think we could suspect that they do, but these conditions existed in these countries before they elected women leaders. So in the piece, I argue that it's a spurious correlation because it's really about the kinds of countries that elect women are also the kinds of countries that contain the coronavirus better. I think that matters because notice that I said that it's different now where women are concentrated than 20 years ago. So I think actually the really important question is, why is it in 2020 that wealthy, stable democracies with high levels of state capacity are more likely to elect women? And why is it seem to be the case that countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding, countries that are poor, countries that are turning towards populism, are not electing women? And I think that pattern is really consequential, and it's really consequential not just for pandemic performance, but it's consequential for a whole range of public policies, because it tells us that right now there's a relationship between being democratic and having women in office, and conversely, democratic backsliding and not having women in office. So it still matters, but I think we need to probe deeper to understand where women are being elected, and I think that has a lot of consequences for sort of the future of global leadership.
Yeah, so 15, 20 years ago, the narrative could have been completely different, right? Where right. The countries with lower state capacity, with women in power, were likely have a harder time addressing COVID, and it could have been like the opposite narrative that we have right now, right?
That's exactly right. And I think that's the second reason I wanted to push back against that narrative as well, right? Because we do know that there's a selection effect for women in leadership, right? So we do know that on average, women politicians might have slightly more qualifications or slightly more experience than a similarly situated man, because there is gender discrimination across the globe when women seek political leadership positions. So on average, right, we might expect that women leaders will have more better capacities to be leaders overall. But the converse is also true. We know that women are punished disproportionately for failing to turn around situations of crisis. So in the piece, I cite some interesting research that shows that women and men who govern during periods of, say, economic crisis, right? Women have shorter tenures in office. They're disproportionately punished by voters for failing to turn the situation around. So if you go back 20 years, now look at the narrative. Oh, these countries have women leaders and the pandemic is out of control. Women are terrible, right? Women can't do anything in politics, right? We need strong men to solve the situation. So I think it can feel really good to promote this narrative that women leaders are better when things seem to be going well, but there's a dark side about when things start to be going badly, that you might start to think that women are especially bad, right? So the flip side of saying women are especially good is that there's a risk of especially bad, and that can have negative consequences for women's ability to access leadership in the long run.
Yeah. So the first article claiming that women leaders were superior during the pandemic appeared around April. And I did a quick look, and there's some examples of that. It also goes across the spectrum, and that's what I think is interesting, right? So I had articles on Forbes, on Wired magazine, on Time, New York Times, The Conversation, Business Insider, NBC News, the Miami Herald, Fortune, and The Guardian. And that's just the ones that, the first 3 pages of Google got to these. And these are all these articles were saying that women were better, and women, and in a way making this argument that women are better, right, at running this, running countries like this. And there had been some articles that, question this narrative and kind of make some of those kind of disposing, that it's more complicated than that, right? But why do you think that the narrative still is overwhelmingly dominated by articles saying, look how good women are?
It's really fascinating because I really can't remember it in recent history. And I asked Dr. Funk this question, who is my co-author in the Washington Post piece, if she could think of an example, and she couldn't. I couldn't think of another recent example where an idea about women in politics has so captured the international public imagination, right? So there's no doubt that this idea has deeply captured the public imagination, not just in the United States, but across the globe. So I think on the one hand, it does confound gender stereotypes, right? So one thing political scientists know is that the chief executive office, so president, prime minister, right, is traditionally dominated by men. So we associate these sort of stereotypically masculine qualities with the chief executive office, right? So you have to be aggressive, you have to be tough, you have to, have sort of a military bearing. But of course, a pandemic isn't a military crisis, right? You can't fight a virus with guns and warships. And so Blair Williams and Carol Johnson, who are 2 political scientists at Australian National University, make this great argument, which is that a pandemic makes people anxious, it makes people fearful, it taps into social issues about health, about society, about well-being. And so they suggest there's something about a pandemic that sort of upends our stereotypes about the kind of person that makes a good chief executive, right? So unlike, a tough, bold leader who will sort of, vanquish his foes, the kind of style that you see a Jacinda Ardern evincing in New Zealand, right, which is very empathetic, which is very reassuring, which is very caring. I mean, Ardern had a press conference to talk directly to the nation's children. So Williams and Johnson really argue that there's something about the pandemic that upends our gendered assumptions about whether women or men are good chief executives, and that there's sort of craving, right, among voters and citizens right now for a more stereotypically feminine leadership style. So this idea that women leaders are better at containing the pandemic really speaks to this sort of need and desire we all have to still think that gender differences are important and still think that.
Another interesting point that that Johnson and Williams make is this discussion that we're now all in the private space, right? We're all quarantining, made us go back to the home, which again, in this perspective, the public versus the private space is a women's realm. So they even reinforce some of the stereotypes. Is another interesting kind of point from that article as well.
That's right. And Dr. Funk in her work, right, both she wrote an article as well as collaborated with me on that Washington Post piece, she does point out that looking at women mayors in the United States, it seems to be the case that cities led by women, the mayors were more attentive to investing in social programs that would insulate folks from the coronavirus's effects, not just on the public health or epidemiological side, but on the social aspects of the economic side. So things like job protection, homelessness, additional sort of support for food insecurity, for healthcare, those sorts of things. So again, it's not that it doesn't matter if you have a woman leader or not, but we need to be really careful when we think about, well, how do women leaders matter? So the point that we make in the Washington Post piece is that women leaders might really matter for making citizens feel cared for, as Williams and Johnson say, or women leaders might really matter for investing in the kinds of social programs that especially vulnerable people need during a pandemic because they've lost their jobs, they've lost their income, their families are struggling. But from an epidemiological standpoint, so the connection between, say, women leaders and issuing shelter-in-place orders, or women leaders and compliance with masking, or women leaders with closing borders, we just don't show evidence that countries led by women did any better on those more disease control metrics relative to some of the other kinds of outcomes that Williams and Johnson and Funk talk about.
Yeah. So, so if we don't or shouldn't focus on this superior performance, that the news organizations are trying to focus on, how else should we argue that countries need more women in politics, that voters should support more women candidates?
Right. So I think justice-based arguments are really important, right? And so, if you look across the world right now, most chief executives are still men, right? Only about 12 women are currently the heads of government in countries where that woman or her party was elected through popular election. So we have like 170 countries and only 12 have women that head the government. So most chief executives across the world are still men. Most members of parliament are still men. Now, some countries elect quite a lot of women to parliament, and we can talk about why that is, because that I've spent a lot of time studying that. But on average, about 3/4 of the globe's parliamentarians are still men. And I love this quote from Ann Phillips, where she says, "There's no argument from justice that can justify the current state of affairs." So unless you're prepared to say that men are naturally superior, there's simply no justification for the fact that the most political offices, 3/4 of them, or in the case of chief executives, say 90% of them, are led by men. And I think the reason of arguing for this on the point of justice is that it breaks with those standards of holding women to higher or better or different standards. Because I don't think it serves the cause of justice to say women can only be in politics if they are better than men, or women can only be in politics if they do something different than men, because that's not a standard that we've asked men to be held to. Right? I think we should all demand more of our political leaders, right? As voters and as citizens, we should all expect that our political leaders protect the public trust, but I think we have to be careful about applying different standards to women or men. So, the international development community loves the argument that if you elect more women, women are magical unicorns and everything will get better. And I understand that these kinds of consequence-based arguments are often more appealing to people, but as I've mentioned a few times, I think they have some real downsides.
Mm-hmm. On your Washington Post article, you end you and Dr. Funk end the article saying that studying gender requires careful research. Can you kind of break it down a little bit more? Like what does it mean to do good gendered research?
Sure. So I think it means a few things, right? So we're political scientists, so we care about these details of political science that other folks might not. So for instance, going back to the media narrative that women leaders are better pandemic performance, right? One thing I noticed about a lot of these articles was that they often confused women heads of government with women heads of state. And so I mentioned a moment ago, there's only about 12 women heads of government. So some countries have these dual executive systems where there's a head of government who actually has policy power, and then there's a head of state who has more of a ceremonial role. And so there are more countries that have women heads of state. And those women heads of state are definitely important. They're recognized in the country. They're often career politicians in their own right, but they don't have actual policy power. So one thing that Dr. Funk and I point out in the piece is that, not all women leaders are alike. So say comparing a woman who's a head of state to a man who's a head of government, those policy decisions might not be directly attributable to that woman head of state. So I think understanding the institutions and the way they work is really important. And again, you know, journalists might not know that, but political scientists do. And I think some of the other things we talked about in this conversation about being really specific about the kinds of outcomes you're looking at, right? So in the monkey cage piece, the Washington Post piece, we say that there's a difference between outcomes that are measuring, say, disease control. So things like shelter in place orders or mask orders, and a difference in outcomes that are measuring social protection, right? So extra programs to insulate marginalized citizens from the recession. And then a difference between citizens' attitudes about men and women as good political leaders. So, you know, when we do this from a research standpoint, we have to be really clear about what we're studying and what sort of cause and effect relationship we're studying. And we don't want to just sort of mix in all of these outcomes that are really different and try to explain them by the same cause. And if we're trying to isolate the cause, we have to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, like one woman head of government to a man head of government, rather than comparing apples and oranges, like a woman head of state and a woman head of government, because those aren't really comparable political positions, even though they're sort of women at the top, right?
So you're also saying we should all take comparative politics?
We should all take comparative politics. You know, I think that would be excellent. And I think that, you know, gender differences are captivating to people, but I think we should also think through the implications of our arguments, right? You know, you mentioned that this narrative about women leaders as good pandemic performers, you know, it came out in April. Well, I don't know in April if anyone thought that I'd still be interviewing with you over Zoom in my in my kitchen in September, you know, but here we are 6 months later where our understanding of the pandemic and how long it's likely to last is really different. And I think you'd probably find people in Germany right now that have a very different story to say about Angela Merkel than they did in April, right? And that doesn't necessarily even mean that Angela Merkel did anything right or wrong, but we just have a lot more information now. And I think also sort of being careful about the kinds of claims and their implications in the long run and not just the short run is something that political scientists should do. You know, not always available to those in the public sphere, but I think it's something for students to think about.
And that was another thing about the pandemic, is that it is something that was so immediate and we had to address it, but it's also happening right now. We need some, as social scientists, we need some time to come back and ask the right questions, you know, later on. So we're making these arguments right now, but we're going to have better arguments in 3-4 years from now too. That's right.
We love data. So unfortunately, the longer the pandemic lasts, the more data we have. Right? Yeah.
Let's hope we have less data for that then.
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you, Dr. Piscopo, for your time. This was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.